In football and in life, chains have a lot of meaning. Chains in our life seem to hold us back. In football, on the sideline, there are chains that represent how close you are to a first down. Growing up, my grandfather would say this all the time: first downs lead to touchdowns. In this series, we're going to be looking at specific areas where we believe first downs will position you toward the touchdowns, the breakthroughs that really matter in life. How's everybody doing this morning? Good? How many of you stayed up way too late watching the Buckeyes? I fell asleep. There you have it. Yeah, of all the games, right? You know, it's not my fault they play that late and I go to work in the morning. Come on. But I'm glad they could win without me screaming at my TV. That's always good news. It's good to know. How many of you really like Christmas movies? Anybody? If I were to start naming my favorite Christmas movies, I could have a lot of you voting, but I'm just going to tell you, I think one of my all-time favorites is A Christmas Story. Now, I sort of hate that TBS plays it 24 hours straight. It sort of ruins some things, but I love A Christmas Story because it is the classic story of an underdog. And it's an underdog who becomes a somebody, right? It's a nobody that becomes a somebody. It's a nobody whose aunt makes him the most ridiculous Christmas present on the planet. Who would make a bunny outfit for a pre-teenage boy, and what mother would make him wear it? Have you guys seen the movie? Yes. Right? Ralphie, poor kid. He's probably in counseling today. But Ralphie had a nemesis, Farkus, right? The green-eyed, snarly-teethed, red-headed monster. And Farkus had a little toady guy that would go and do his bidding, and that little kid only had courage when Farkus was around. Did you ever notice that? He was always big and tough when his bully friend had his back. And you know, I think that's interesting because you see, courage is a derivative. Courage is always derived from something. Its source is always derived from someplace else. And so today, as we talk about fear, and we're going to continue in this series, moving the chains, and so glad the Buckeyes did some of that last night. They remind me of the Cardiac Kids. Any Browns fans here going back in the day? A little terrifying. Courage is always required. Courage is always required if you are going to overcome your fears. Courage is required if you want to overcome your fears. It's not suggested, it's required. I don't know if you're like anybody else that I know, you have fears. We all have fears. Everybody has fears in our life. But the difference between fear and faith is one, faith gives us sound belief. Fear gives us irrational thought. And courage is required if you are going to overcome your fear. So if you brought your Bible, you can turn. We're going to continue right on this narrative that the entire series is based on. It's based on the life of David. Last week we looked at how David was anointed to become the king of Israel. David was overlooked by his whole family. His entire family left him in the field, but the Lord called him to the table. When his family thought he was a nobody, God made him a somebody. 1 Samuel 17, we read about this epic story that I think is oftentimes overlooked. And it's the story of David facing the giant Goliath. You know, I was sharing that story over lunch one time with somebody that was not a part of our church, and they didn't realize that story was in the Bible. They thought it was a business analogy. You know, it's easy for us to take for granted that people know what we know or believe what we believe at the expense of advancing the truth because we make assumptions. They thought it was a business analogy. They didn't even realize it was a biblical story. Now the Philistines had gathered their forces for war. The Philistines had gathered their forces for war, assembled at Succoth in Judah. The Philistines had gathered their forces for war, but they were advancing on Israel. They were drawing battle lines, but they came to Israel's territory. It would be like somebody coming into your yard and shouting into your house, "Let's get this on. Let's do this now. Let's take this up a notch here." That's what they're doing. They're calling them out. They're calling them out with the intentionality of trying to overtake Israel and make Israel become their subjects. The Philistines were arch enemies of Israel for a long, long time. And they didn't want to continue having arguments. Now they wanted to bring it to a fight. Verse 4, a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall. That Shaq on steroids. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. He had so much stuff, he had to have somebody help him carry it. Right? I mean, this guy's a giant. He's got the most advanced military armament at his disposal. All the things that he could possibly want that were available in that day were his. And he had an assistant. And he's a champion. Probably of eating contest, among other things. Goliath stood, verse 8, and shouted to the ranks of Israel. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he's able to fight and kill me, we'll become your subjects. If I overcome him and kill him, you'll become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing his words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Would you say terrified? Terrified. They weren't like, "Oh man, this is bad." I mean, they're shaking. They are terrified. Right? They're terrified like, what do we do next? It's sort of like when you're driving home with your first newborn child. Terrified. Dads in the room can understand. Moms are like, "We've got this." Good. He's doing something that was normal in that day. So the Israelites are on one side, the Philistines are on the other side, and there's a valley in the middle. They're both on hills. And Goliath is coming out, and he's saying, "Why are you lining up?" Because the Israelites wanted to fight as an army. They wanted to fight as a team. They wanted to go against the other army. But they're trying, the Philistines are saying, "We don't really want to fight like that. Let's not shed so much blood. Let's not spill so much blood. Let's have a duel of champions. And whatever champion wins, the other army becomes our servants. We get the plunder. We get your stuff." And he goes so far as to say, am I not a Philistine? And aren't you servants of Saul? He's calling Saul out. Because in that day, kings went to battle. Kings were the fighting men. They led the charge. Big mouth Goliath is going, your king's a sissy. It's not like it is today. The strategists didn't stay back behind the lines. The strategists were at the front of the lines. That's how it was fought in those days. Saul wasn't really all that interested. This went on for 40 days. In the middle of all that, verse 17, now Jesse said to his son David, and Jesse's old now. Jesse's well advanced in years, it tells us. In verse 12. Verse 17, now Jesse said to his son David, take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread to your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them. They're with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah fighting against the Philistines. Jesse's saying, listen, I want you to go and find out how your brothers are doing. I want you to go and bring back some assurance that they're okay. It's been a long time. They've been gone a while. You know what's really cool? David thought he was delivering lunch. He didn't know he was about to deliver a nation. He thought he was becoming the first carrier of Jimmy John's. He didn't realize he was about to bring deliverance to an entire country. So David left his flock early in the morning. He went to do his father's bidding. David gets to the camp. He's overhearing what some of the other soldiers are saying because Saul kept upping the ante for somebody else to fight the giant. Saul kept trying to talk somebody else into doing his job. David overhears it, and he wants to know more. Verse 26, David asked the men standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine? When Nathan was little, David and Goliath was one of his favorite all-time Bible stories. And you had to be careful with Nathan because he didn't have much of a filter when he was a toddler. And Melissa had Nathan at Kroger or Publix, whatever the supermarket was when we were living in Atlanta that she happened to be at. And whenever he would see somebody really big, he would point and say, it's an uncircumcised Philistine. I thought it was hilarious. I didn't do a lot of shopping. Anyway, David asked the guys standing around, who is this guy? And why are we so afraid of him? What he is saying is, he's not a person of covenant promise. Amen. To understand that last phrase, you have to understand the context of being in covenant promise with the God of the angel armies, the Father of Abraham, the one who said, I will create a nation for myself, and they will be my people, and I will be their God. We will live in a covenant together. And David's saying, listen, we're the covenant people. Who's this joker that's not part of that tribe that's yelling out these murderous threats? Because see, when everybody else was intimidated, David was offended. When everybody else was intimidated, David was offended. There's a huge difference there, isn't there? They repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, this is what will be done for the man who kills him. When Eliab, we talked about him last week, it's his oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the desert? Well, it's good to see you too. I brought you lunch. His brother's not interested in David. As a matter of fact, he doesn't even like him. He likes him less now than he did the week before, or when Samuel anointed him king. Why have you come down here? Who'd you leave your few piddly sheep with in the desert? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. You came down because the cable went out. The Wi-Fi crashed. He's completely discrediting his character. He's completely discrediting David's self-worth. He's completely discrediting who David is at a base level inside. And then David said, verse 29, like any little brother would, now what have I done? Can't I even speak? Then he turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter. And the men answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. Verse 32, David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go fight him. And then this is awesome. Verse 33, Saul said, there, little boy. You're not able to go out against the Philistine and fight him. You're only a boy. And he's been a fighting man since his youth. How about that? Thanks, son. It's nice. You're stirring up trouble in the camp. Why don't you get on home? It's good to see you. And David doesn't take no for an answer. See, David's going to charge the Philistine with or without the approval and consent of his older brother, and probably with or without the consent of the king of the nation. David is either going to do it with you or in spite of you. That's how this is about to shake out, right? Now, I don't condone vigilantism against the law or spiritually. But David is so consumed because he's so offended by this punk-mouthed giant. Verse 34, David said to Saul, your servant's been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by the hair, struck it, killed it. Boom. Next. Bear, same thing. Boom. Next. The same God who saved me from the paw of the bear and the lion has got me from the big lips of the Philistine. He's got this. See, David didn't have self-confidence. He had Godfidence. He had God confidence. He wasn't confident just in his own ability. He was confident in the God who gave him authority in his ability. After Saul heard all about the lion and the bear, he said, go, and the Lord be with you. Then Saul said, wait a minute, let's put on all these clothes of mine for you. You can read it for yourself. Verse 38, then Saul dressed David in his own tunic, probably trying to make him look taller, and put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic, and David tried to walk around because he wasn't used to them. I can't go out in these. Can you just, do you see how this is going down? It's like a bad day of dress up. None of it fits. There's a spiritual principle here. Don't try to wear somebody else's armament. Live in your gifting. I can't go out in these, he said to Saul, because I'm not used to them. So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand. He was used to it. That's what shepherds carried. Chose 5 smooth stones from the stream. Put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag. And with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. Now I've got a question. How many stones do you think he selected for that same sling before he picked up the 5 stones? I'm going to guess it was thousands. I'm going to guess he walked the riverbeds, picked up lots and lots of stones, and knew what kind of stone flew the best. I'm going to guess that when he was sitting out in the desert, he took aim at a lot of other things that were non-moving targets or slow-moving targets like a giant might be. Linemen aren't fast. If they were, they would be fullbacks. I bet David had flung and slung stones out of that slingshot thousands and thousands of times until he became so dangerous he could hit a rabbit at 30 yards. It wasn't his first ready aim moment. It wasn't his first let me choose the ammo moment. Anyway. Meanwhile, the Philistine with his shield bearer in front of him kept coming closer and closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was only a boy, ruddy and handsome, and he despised him because he was probably big and ugly. Really? I mean, come on. Y'all stayed up too late? He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here, I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." And David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and a javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me." Now, I love how he trash talks him right here. I mean, he has to strike fear in the giant. "This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head." Up the ante. "You're going to feed me to birds. I'm decapitating you." "Today I'll give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth. And the whole world will know there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it's not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle's the Lord's. And He will give all of you into our hands." You know what David just did? He just redrew the battle lines. He just renegotiated the war. Right? He didn't call a committee. He just wrote a check with his mouth. See, it was going to be, well, now the Philistines will serve us. I'm going to kill you and all your friends. Because all your friends have put up with this nonsense you've been spouting for 40 days. And so now they're guilty by association. Do you think do you think Goliath was scared yet? No, me neither. And his shield bearer is probably going, "Can I set this down yet? Are we done?" Well, we know the rest of the story. It only took one of the 5 rocks. We know the rest of the story. David took aim. He sunk the stone between his eyeballs. We know the rest of the story that David went and took Goliath's sword. Who knows where the armor bearer went? We know the rest of the story. He lops off his head and takes it back to Saul. What a gruesome gift. We know the rest of the story, that the nation of Israel, who lacked confidence because they lacked courage. Now we're going to get to all that in just a minute. We know that they chased the Philistines and overtook them and killed them that day, slaughtered them. A few interesting highlights that I didn't plan to touch on. If you go to 2 Samuel verse 21, you'll see that there were 4 other relatives of Goliath who were also giants. There's 5 stones. He used one. In David's lifetime, he would face all of them. When David was running for his life, at one point he took the sword of Goliath again. Anyway, there's a lot in here. As you study God's Word, let it unpack for you. But here's the point I want to make. God will kill the giants. God will kill the giants. You have to pick up the stones. I love the book of Daniel. It's such a great book. It's about the Babylonian captivity of Israel. I believe God will protect you in the fire, but you have to get in the furnace. I believe God still shuts the mouth of the lions, but you have to get in the den. I believe God still slays the giants, but you have to pick up the stones. I don't know what your fears are and where you need to move the chains in your life, but it'll take courage. And courage is a derivative. David, a derivative is always... It's something that's based on another source. It's something that is derived from another source. It's a derivative. Courage is a derivative. And David's courage was a derivative of his faith. You know, David didn't fight the giant because he had self-confidence. He fought the giant because he had courage derived by his faith. David faced his fears. David faced everybody else's fears, because his faith went first. And if you allow your fear to go first, your faith will always come in last. David was not ever going to allow his faith to come in last. He was always going to lead with his faith. Live by, not by. We'll try that again. The answers are faith and sight. Live by, not by. One more time, louder, like you were yelling at your TV. Live by, faith, not by sight. Right. When you lead by faith, your fear is slayed. When you lead by fear, your faith is slayed. Right? Courage. Courage is always a derivative. Courage is required. If you want to overcome your fear. I'm convinced throughout our lives we will all face Goliath. And we will face his relatives, just like David had to throughout his life. He didn't just face one giant, he faced 5. He didn't just face one battle, he had many. You know what I love about David, and you're going to watch it unfold throughout the rest of this series on Move the Chains. I love that David was a complex, imperfect person serving a perfect, loving, empowering God. We're going to look at the totality of how this guy's life unfolds. We're going to look at how he was a pretty good king, but a really lousy dad until later in his life. We're going to look, as we talk about different pieces of his life, how it unfolds and how God redeems. But at this stage of his life, this is what I know. Without faith, your fear always wins. And if you lead by fear, your faith always loses. I don't know what your Goliath might be. I don't know what your Goliath was in the past. I don't know which one you're facing in the present. I don't know if your Goliath is self-confidence. I've met many people that I've said this very phrase to. If I could give you one gift, it would be this. It would be self-confidence. The ability to like yourself and be confident in yourself. I don't know if you have a Goliath of self-loathing in your life. I don't know if you have a Goliath of unforgiveness and anger toward God in your life. I don't know if you have a Goliath in your relationships that's been holding you back in your life. But I do know this. I know in our life at different stages, we all face giants. And the question is, are you going to let the giant back you down in fear? Or are you going to stare the giant in the eyes and back it down in faith? And if you want to move the chains, you'll never do it by living through fear. You will never move the chains toward a breakthrough in your life by living through the filter of your fear. It's only through your faith.